Welcome to Trust Talk. Today we explore the intersection of trust, social justice, and power in modern society. Our guest is Musa al-Gharbi, sociologist and author of the new book, We Have Never Been Woke. Drawing from his own experiences moving between small-town America and elite academic circles, al-Gharbi challenges some of the most widely held beliefs about inequality, privilege, and the credibility of those who claim to speak for marginalized groups. In this conversation, we'll dive into the contradictions at the heart of contemporary social justice movements, the complex relationship between wokeness and trust, and why well-intentioned activism sometimes deepens public cynicism instead of restoring confidence. We'll also ask, what would it really take to rebuild trust across lines of class, race, and ideology? Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Musa, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Today we are talking about your new book, We Have Never Been Woke. The title itself makes a bold statement, and one of the big ideas you explore is this: that many elites, people in positions of power, often say all the right things about being anti-racist, feminist or progressive, but at the same time they still benefit from the very systems they claim to oppose. Could you share one or two examples from the book that really show how that plays out in real life?
Yeah. One of the striking things that I try to stress in the book is it's not just that elites often passively benefit. It's that in many ways we benefit more than most people, and we kind of actively exploit a lot of the people we say that we want to help. So a quick example. I talk about in the book how in a lot of professional families in places like Manhattan and San Francisco and so on, both partners in a marriage work full-time, and they also have children, and their children usually, in many cases, have really intensive activities, really intense, tightly managed schedules, all these things that the kids are doing, the sports and all this kind of stuff. And so you might wonder, how do they make all this happen? Because there's all this stuff that needs to happen. Food needs to get on the table. Kids have all these activities, house needs to get cleaned. How does the math work? You might think, well, how the math works is the men are feminists, so they just pick up their share of the housework and the women and the men do about 50-50 in the domestic duties and so on. That's not the case. Statistically, empirically, it's still the case that the women do the overwhelming majority of the domestic work. The way that these families actually are able to live their elite lifestyles and have two people work is to hire these other women to do the women's work. So instead of the wife, the female professional, doing this women's work, they hire other women to take care of the kids, to clean the house, to prepare meals, to take care of the elderly and the sick and pets and stuff like this. So other women are doing this, quote, women's work. And critically, in a world where these families were buying a bunch of additional feminized labor and they were paying these women that they're hiring to do all this work, that they were paying them good wages, then the salary they get, the benefits of the dual earner model would be significantly reduced. If most of the second salary is just going to paying other women to do the, quote, women's work, then they wouldn't benefit much financially. So the way that they actually are able to benefit from their second salary, in many cases, is by underpaying these women that they're hiring to do these other jobs. And one of the ways that they're really good at finding people that they can underpay and squeeze really tight in terms of labor is to go out of their way to hire undocumented immigrants. And so in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, other liberal bastions like that, you'll regularly see undocumented immigrants pushing around little white kids and things like this. And the thing about it is that the decision to target undocumented immigrants to do this feminized labor is a choice. And the reason why people make that choice is because they understand that these are workers who are in a vulnerable and precarious position, so you can demand a lot more out of them, and they can't really make a fuss, because if they make a fuss, that's a problem for them. They can get deported, they can find themselves in trouble, so they just tolerate a bunch of negative stuff, and you can pay them a lot less than you'd have to pay an American citizen to do that same job. You recognize you can pay them less. Now, there's nothing written in the rules of the universe that say if you do hire an undocumented immigrant, you have to pay them a lot less than an American. That's a choice that we make. People find these folks who are desperate and vulnerable. They choose to pay them a lot less than they would pay anyone else. And they do this so that they can profit from it and live their feminist dream. But this whole dream is premised on the exploitation of other women and of the subordination of other women.
These days the word woke gets tossed around a lot, usually as an insult, but it didn't start that way. Originally it was a kind of warning within black communities, telling people to stay alert to injustice. So what happened? How did woke go from that grassroots message to a catch-all label for liberal or left-wing politics, especially in the US and now even in Europe?
So a nice analogy I like to give in the book is to look at the history of the word political correctness, which was the word we used to use instead of woke in the 90s, the last time we had these big blowups over these same issues. What you saw in both cases is that these are words that went back for a long time, for decades. Political correctness goes back to the 60s. Woke and versions of woke go back to even the 1800s. And so what happened was within the left, when they said my views are politically correct, they literally meant my moral and political views are correct. And when people use the word politically incorrect, they usually meant it like today we would say you're being problematic. Eventually, there came to be this divide, though, within the left, where one faction of the left understood political correctness to mean my moral political views are correct. Another faction of the left started to understand political correctness associated with this purely symbolic, sanctimonious form of politics. And eventually, this dispute within the left got picked up by the right, and they started bashing everything that they didn't like as politically correct or PC. And eventually, it became difficult for people on the left to identify as politically correct or PC. No one continued to identify that way themselves. And eventually, even to be politically incorrect took on kind of a positive valence. And you see a similar thing playing out with woke today. So you have this kind of dispute within the left about wokeness and whether or not it's actually a good approach to politics and dealing with social problems. That dispute within the left got picked up by the right, who started using it basically as a slur for everything that they didn't like. And so now we're at a stage where there are very few people on the left who would self-identify as woke.
In the book you describe arriving at Columbia University and being surrounded by people who talked a lot about justice and equality, really confidently, but still enjoyed all the perks of elite status. Was there a moment when you thought something about this feels off?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that they enjoyed the perks of elite status. One of the things that's striking is that the whole point of going to a school like Columbia in the first place is that it's a school whose whole purpose, in a deep sense, one of its core purposes is to reproduce and justify inequalities, to mark people as elites, and therefore justify them having greater access to super elite jobs, to high-powered political positions, and so on, in virtue of their presumed merits because they graduated from Columbia. There's not really a meaningful sense in which an institution like Columbia University could be progressive or something like that. The whole point of the institution is to reproduce inequalities. So there's that fundamental tension baked in. And that's the reason why these folks are going to Columbia. The reason why you go to Columbia instead of your local land-grant school is because you recognize that going to a school like Columbia will change your life, will put you on a different trajectory. This is why people work so hard to get into these schools. It's why they cry tears of joy when they get in, feel deep sorrow when they don't. And so, yeah, I was at Columbia. After the election of Donald Trump, I guess, was one of the first things that really started getting me thinking about this. Because after the election, there were all these students and faculty members who were so traumatized by the election that they felt they couldn't do their jobs, they couldn't take their tests, they couldn't do their classes, and so on. And they often kind of painted themselves as being especially vulnerable to Trump and his regime, like they're the ones who are going to be suffering and so on. And there was like a few things about this that were striking to me. This is a school that's by and for elites. And so in our own stories about what would happen after Trump won, that the poor would be crushed underfoot and the rich and the powerful would be better off than ever. We're the rich and the powerful. We're at an Ivy League university. But instead of recognizing this basic fact, again, a lot of the students and faculty members were painting themselves as marginalized and disadvantaged and so on. And another thing that was striking is that when you looked at the people who were more appropriately described as marginalized, disadvantaged, and so on, There's this whole other constellation of workers at Columbia University: the janitors, the groundskeepers, the security guards, the people serving food in the cafeteria. Those people are especially likely to be, say, Black or Hispanic. They get paid a lot less. They're from much less affluent backgrounds. Many of them are immigrants and so on. So they're the kind of people who, in our narratives about what the election portended, would stand to be the most victimized. But there was no movement on Columbia University's campuses to support the janitors, to support the groundskeepers. They were completely invisible to the students. Students and faculty were focused on themselves. And I'll just add, when you looked at these other workers, you didn't see them coming to work the day after the election, sobbing about politics. They just showed up the next day and did their job. And this juxtaposition was one of the things that led me to ask myself, well, what's going on here?
That brings me to the next question. In the book, you talk about how elite spaces often use what you call justice language. These careful, symbolic ways of talking about inequality that sounds progressive, but can actually blur what's really going on. I think you just gave an example of that. Like calling poor people individuals of limited means, or referring to prisoners as justice-involved persons. It sounds polite, it's polished, but it can feel disconnected from real life.
And there's kind of two big problems with this tendency. The first is that one of the things that this kind of linguistic game does in practice is help mark people as being products of elite education and not. So if you're someone who's not from an elite background, you didn't go to the good schools, then you probably don't know the current lingo for how we're supposed to talk about these groups. It's a class distinction marker. The second big problem with this tendency is that there's actually a lot of research that shows that one of the core goals of euphemism, one of the main reasons why we do euphemisms, is that it makes it easier for us to tolerate negative states of affairs. Instead of calling someone a prisoner, calling them a justice-involved person. Justice-involved person actually sounds nice. Calling someone a prisoner underscores the brutality of their situation more. Calling someone homeless as opposed to, I don't know, unsheltered or something like this. These kinds of terms that make us feel uncomfortable, the fact that they make us feel uncomfortable is good, that it disturbs us morally that there are prisoners and homeless people and so on in our own communities is good. That's actually a healthy impulse. And to the extent that we kind of change the language in ways that make it easier for us to talk about those people and to be less troubled by their conditions and so on, that's not something that's going to be useful for actually addressing a social justice. And the fact that we're dedicating a lot of energy into managing how people talk about these conditions rather than dedicating that energy to trying to do something meaningful to actually help. If you're someone who's living on the streets, your top priority in life isn't whether or not someone refers to you as homeless or unsheltered. There's a sense in which the whole thing is a distraction from the actual problem as well.
Let's talk about DEI, almost a curse word these days. You write that those programs have opened doors for people who were already doing pretty well, especially women and people of color in elite spaces, but haven't really made things more equal overall. Why do you think there's such a gap between the good intentions and the actual impact?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons. One of the problems is that the institutions that have really embraced DEI the most and that have changed their policies are mostly themselves elite institutions. So for instance, a lot of corporate boards, after George Floyd was killed, tried to work hard to fold more African Americans into their corporate boards. Here's the thing, though. In order to be considered for the board of, say, Goldman Sachs, you typically needed to already have had an illustrious career at an elite consulting and finance firm, which probably requires you to have gone to the Ivy League. Even if you didn't come from an elite background, if you've had the kind of illustrious career in finance and consulting that would make you a plausible candidate for the Goldman Sachs board, chances are you're already a multimillionaire or a billionaire. Is it like bad to create more opportunities for more Black millionaires and billionaires? No, I guess, but like, what does that do for the typical African American or especially the less advantaged person? Basically, nothing. And the same thing is true for a lot of these other initiatives that occur within symbolic capitalist spaces. Is the only people who would stand to benefit from them are people who have college degrees. That's one of the limitations. The other limitation is just that a lot of this stuff, a lot of the specific initiatives that we do to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're just not effective. There's a strong empirical literature on why things like diversity training, for instance, often generate blowback and animus towards the people that we're trying to help, why a lot of the symbolic gestures can actually lead to more turnover and more tension within institutions. And then the last thing I'll say, one big problem with the way some of these initiatives are designed as well, is that, say, in colleges and universities, a lot of the views that are like associated with quote wokeness, the ways of talking and thinking about the world, if you look at the distribution of attitudes in America, the people who are most likely to be quote woke are highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban white people. The people who are in America who are least likely to embrace these views include religious minorities, ethnic minorities, people from less affluent backgrounds, people whose parents were less educated, people who took non-traditional routes through education, people who lived in small towns and urban areas, and so on. So the upshot of this is, in an institution like higher learning, if you create an atmosphere that's hostile towards, say, socially conservative or religious views, the people who are going to be affected by that the most aren't rich white people. Rich white people are actually the most likely to be woke. If you look at who in America is most likely to be socially conservative or religious, it's the very people who are already underrepresented in higher ed. We often create this kind of hostile atmosphere in the name of diversity and inclusion that most adversely affects the very people who are already underrepresented. If we look at polls and surveys, even though higher ed is a really progressive space, one of the most progressive spaces you'll find culturally and so on, people who are African Americans and so on often say they feel like they don't belong in these institutions. And what we assume is that the reason they feel like they don't belong is because we're just not progressive enough yet. We need to go harder. In fact, one of the big problems might be that these institutions they're just too fiercely oriented around this unusual way of talking and thinking that's popular among relatively affluent urban and suburban whites and is basically alien to everyone else. The problem is that these institutions are too, quote, woke, not that they're not woke enough.
You've written about how in elite spaces like media or academia, identity can boost someone's credibility. Being seen as black, queer, working class, or an immigrant can give them moral authority. But when those same people succeed within the system without really challenging it, it raises questions. Does that kind of identity signaling make it harder for people to trust institutions that claim to stand for justice?
Well, it does for a bunch of reasons. One thing that's very clear, for instance, in polling and survey data, is that the only people who really, really, really want institutions to talk about race, gender, and sexuality aggressively, people who want policies to be explicitly designed to benefit members of particular racial groups and with the explicit purpose of addressing racial inequalities. Basically, the only people in America who are really into that are symbolic capitalists, relatively affluent, urban and suburban, highly educated people who are tied to the knowledge professions. Most other Americans don't really like this way of talking and thinking about the world. They find it alienating. They find it alienating when politicians talk about race, 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 gender, gender, gender. They find it divisive. They find it unjust. A policy that helps only disadvantaged African Americans is a policy that ignores other disadvantaged people on the basis of their race. So if you're white and you're poor, you don't qualify because you don't belong to the target group. Most Americans, there's a lot of polling and surveys on this, find this kind of an approach to politics unfair. What most Americans prefer is for politicians and other political actors, for institutions to be focused on things like shared values, common goals, superordinate identities. So like you're black, I'm white, we're both Americans. So superordinate identities, overlapping interests. Like this is what most people would prefer institutions to do. And so if you were going to try to address poverty, for instance, most Americans would prefer a policy that just helps poor people, irrespective of things like their gender and race. You can even address things like racialized inequalities through formally race-neutral policies in some cases. So for instance, if African Americans are more likely than others to be poor as a result of historical inequalities and things like this, if you design a policy that helps poor people, then that will already disproportionately benefit African Americans. And so this is an approach to policy design, to talking about social issues and so on, that's more resonant with most people.
My final question, because we're almost running out of our time, is if we really want to rebuild trust in institutions or social movements, what needs to change? Not just in the way we talk, but in the way things actually work. What would it look like to share power more fairly and to hold people truly accountable?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I stress in the book is that when we look at the mistrust that a lot of folks have in institutions, the narrative we like to tell is that the reason people mistrust these institutions is because they're brainwashed by Fox News and Donald Trump and so on. This is a problematic narrative for two reasons. First, most of the evidence suggests that brainwashing really isn't a thing. Most people actually aren't super susceptible to being manipulated, to propaganda. Propaganda typically fails and so on. There's a great book on this by Hugo Mercier called Not Born Yesterday that summarizes a lot of this research in this area. So that's one problem. The deeper problem with this narrative, though, is that the reason that a lot of people mistrust our institutions is because they actually aren't really representative of people like them. Their values, their interests actually aren't represented well in our institutions. That's not a misinformation. That's not Fox News manipulation. It's a brutal reality of these institutions, as I show at length in the book. They actually aren't representative of most other people's values and interests. And so it's imperative for our institutions, even as we're trying to defend ourselves against some of the attacks in our institutions and justify our value, we also need to recognize and explicitly try to address some of the ways in which our institutions are genuinely not representing and serving huge and growing swaths of the population.
Musa, thank you very much. As a last question, how is the book doing? Is it already published or is it about to be published?
Yeah, it's already published in the US and in most international markets. It's doing pretty well. It's doing very well commercially. In terms of critical reception, actually, it's been very positive too. I've been kind of humbled, surprised, blown away, delighted, whatever.
Great. Well, thanks again for being our guest today and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.